Animals. Start with the basics. Animals come in lots of different shapes and sizes, like this moth with its super long tongue to feed on nectar from that flower. We're going to look at animal anatomy and animal physiology, and if you had anatomy and physiology class, this, of course, section becomes a little bit easier. Okay, we're going to look at structures, and we're going to look at functions. Remember that in anything, structure equals function. This is a big concept in biology. Okay, and so what an animal looks like, its size and shape directly affect how it exchanges stuff with its surroundings. Now, at a cellular level, remember that we're exchanging substances that are dissolved in water. It says aqueous medium. That's essentially water. Okay, and they have to diffuse and be transported across cell membranes. So if you're a one-celled thing like an amoeba, diffusion occurs directly. If you're a hydra, which is a basically two-layer cell layer thing, you have to have diffusion with the outside and diffusion with the inside. As you get multicellular and more complex, you have to have different ways of exchanging materials. So here's a general overview of an animal. Could be anything from a worm to a human. Okay, you have to have a way to get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, because animals are all heterotrophic. They have to get food. We'll talk about that in a minute. You have to have a way to exchange nutrients. You have to have a way to get them around your body with a circulatory system. And then you have what's called the interstitial fluid, which is where outside of all these organs, materials are located. Okay, and that's where the cells are. So just a quick review then. Animals are composed of cells, which are organized into tissues. This is what this slide says. I'm just abbreviating. Tissues are organized into organs, and organs are organized into organ systems. So here's an example in an organ called the stomach. There are 4 kinds of tissues. Epithelial tissue, which is a lining tissue. Connective tissue, that connects, so that's this layer here. Muscle tissue for movement. And then what's not in here, they call this serosa, connective and epithelial tissue, nervous tissue, which is a separate one all by itself. 4 kinds of tissue. Here is a list of the organ systems. You should probably know these and generally what they do. We're going to take some time with all of them in this unit. So in general, remember that all animals are heterotrophic, therefore they require chemical energy from outside themselves. And what do they need it for? Well, all those things there. And the chemical energy, remember, comes from food plus oxygen. So we can measure how much energy an animal needs with something called bioenergetics. How much food does something need to live? We look at this in anatomy and physiology class. We'll also look at it here a little bit. So in quick review, an animal takes in food. It needs it for the carbon skeletons to build itself. It also needs it for energy. Some of the energy of the food is lost as heat as you digest and absorb things. Some of the food goes out in your solid waste. The nutrient molecules get into your body cells. Some of them you urinate out. You do cell respiration. 63% of cell respiration is heat. Remember, heat is free energy, unusable. You make ATP, 37% of all the energy you take in goes there. Some of that ATP is used to make you. What's left over after you break apart some of this food is you use carbon skeletons. You put those together using ATP. Okay, and I say you, but this could be true for any animal. And some ATP is used to just do work in cells. And notice all of the heat. So we can measure metabolic rate. We did this with the P's first semester in the respirometer. We can measure either oxygen consumed or carbon dioxide produced. I'll leave it to you to remember which one we actually did. And here's a couple ways to do it. You can put a crab in a chamber. You can do the P's in that little respirometer we had. Here's a guy with a respirometer attached. So he's monitoring how much oxygen he uses. An animal's metabolic rate is closely related to its, quote, bioenergetic strategy. And we don't think about this. This is just how it works. Birds and mammals, endotherms. They are warmed up by heat generated by all metabolism, remember, is the sum of all the chemical reactions. So we typically, endotherms, have higher metabolic rates than ectotherms. Amphibians and reptiles are ectotherms. They get their heat from outside themselves. Here's a quick graph. River otter is an endotherm. Here's its body temperature at varying environmental temperatures as the water gets colder. Here's an ectotherm, largemouth bass. Look what happens to its body temperature as the temperature gets colder or as the temperature gets warmer. There are other things that affect metabolic rate, and I'm going to kind of skip through this really fast. Size and activity are two. We'll talk about size in a minute. Metabolic rate per gram is inversely related to body size. We'll come back to that. The basal metabolic rate is called the BMR. It's the metabolic rate of an endotherm at rest. And I don't know that you need to remember the difference between BMR and SMR. So let's take a look at some energy budgets then with this graph. Okay, here's a 60 kilogram female human. She's pregnant. Okay, and look at her graph at how much of her energy is spent on a variety of different things. Okay, here's a male penguin. Remember in Antarctica, male penguins sit on their eggs. Here's a female deer mouse nursing her young. Here's a female python protecting her eggs. Now, look at how much energy each one of them spends. Look at how much energy the deer mouse spends on temperature regulation. That's pretty interesting. A deer mouse is an endotherm. But because it's so small, its surface area to volume ratio is really high. So a deer mouse loses all kinds of heat to its surroundings. Notice how little the penguin spends on energy production. Okay, compared to the mouse, just because it's so much bigger, and how much less the human spends on temperature regulation. Notice the python spends 0 on temperature regulation. Why? I'll let you figure that one out yourself. So, animals can regulate their internal environment pretty narrowly. Remember, the internal environment is called the interstitial fluid, and we're talking about vertebrates now, not things like sponges. Okay, that's the liquid, essentially, that's around all your cells. Homeostasis is the balance, and we said in biology, is the ability to maintain a constant internal environment. internal environment. And that's pretty much what this says. Okay? There are two things. You just have to recognize these terms. A regulator is what endotherms are. We regulate our internal control mechanisms. We regulate our temperature internally. A conformer varies with external changes. If we're talking about ectotherms, ectotherms are conformers to their outside temperature. Now, there are other things we're talking about here, so it's not necessarily true all the way for both endotherms and ectotherms, but that's just a way to remember it. So a homeostatic control mechanism has three components: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. Okay, and we're going to come back to this idea over and over again in this unit. Okay, the idea that there's something to sense a change, something to do something about the change, something to get the message to the control center that does something about the change. The example they give in the textbook is that of a thermostat in your house. Okay, the thermostat is a control center. As the room temperature increases, there's a thermometer on there that recognizes that. Thermostat turns off the heater, so the room temperature goes back down, and so on. So the process by which animals maintain an internal temperature is called thermoregulation. Of course, to be endothermic takes more energy. We have to eat more than a snake. Snakes only eat once in every great while. Why can they do that? They don't need to spend so much energy heating themselves. There are four modes then of heat exchange. How do we exchange heat with our environment? Well, we conduct it. It goes out of us. It can be convected by wind, radiation, and evaporation. Here's an example. Okay, convection, as wind goes by us, it removes heat from us. Radiation, the sun heats up this lizard's body. Conduction, it sits on a warm rock that already got heated by the sun. You turn on your electric blanket, it conducts heat into you. You lose heat by evaporation when you sweat. Maybe you've been wet on a windy day, so you got evaporation and convection going on. So to be able to thermoregulate, there are 5 adaptations animals have, and you should know these. We're going to talk about adaptations in detail in this unit. Insulation is an adaptation. Okay? Blubber in whales, fur in some animals. Circulatory adaptations. We'll come back to that. Evaporation, sweating. Behavior is an adaptation. Going in the shade is an adaptation. And then adjusting metabolic heat production. How much do you put out, if you will? Our skin in humans is our heat conduction regulator. We have sweat glands. We have muscles that make goosebumps. Okay? We have insulation with fat. Some of us, many endotherms and some ectotherms control the amount of blood. We can dilate our blood vessels, vasodilation, to make them bigger. That makes our skin red. We can constrict the blood vessels near the skin. Lowers heat loss. That happens when you get really cold. That'll happen in your fingers because your body redirects the blood flow to the center. Sweating, panting, okay, bathing. Torpor. Torpor is when an animal basically doesn't do anything. And then hibernation is long-term torpor. Now, what most people don't understand about hibernation is that this is an off and on thing. Here's an example. Whoa. Here's this type of ground squirrel that as the air outside temperature goes down, this graph shows its actual metabolism, how much energy it's spending. Because the temperature gets so cold, the ground squirrel goes down in its burrow for October for 6 months of the year, August through April. It has periodic arousals, comes outside, checks what's going on. But notice, look at all the metabolism that would be necessary to stay alive in the winter. But because it goes into torpor, where it goes and basically burrows down and just sleeps all winter with very little going on, because it has the ability to do that, okay, if you think about the sum of the chemical reactions that happen in that organism, it can live much longer this way. That's the end of the discussion about energy.